really delighted to be working with AQA for this session, and just to say that I think that they come from, the colleagues at AQA come from a place of wide-ranging, thoughtful contributions to the educational landscape that is beyond the first function of the examinations and the qualifications, much wider, purposeful intent around their work. And, you know, I really want to praise that and give credit to that. So to create this space, actually, for instance, for this session this afternoon, so I'm going to be just sharing some insights around Key Stage 3 and why we might, I'm going to make the case, that we treat it as the intellectual powerhouse of the curriculum when we're thinking in a secondary context. There are a number of reasons for this, but I think we can really make far stronger claims for the space and the place of Key Stage 3, which has sometimes been a little bit neglected, actually sometimes for understandable reasons, and I'm going to unpick some of those and suggest some solutions or some possible routes through. So 3 broad things that I'm going to be sharing in this session, and I would say that these are just one person's perspective, and so it means it's always up for debate. No one person, no one individual has all the answers. And so whatever I offer, I expect, you know, in any kind of forum, I expect people to disagree with some elements, if not all of it, which is absolutely fine, absolutely legitimate, because it's through discussion and debate, respectful disagreement, that our insights about professional practice, professional pedagogies, professional insights in the curriculum grow. And so for me, that's healthy. But just, I suppose the main point I want to make is just because I'm offering this, it's not set in stone, obviously. So 3 main elements that I shall be threading through the time I'm with you. First of all, making the case for there to be real rigor at Key Stage 3, some of the research insights that can help us negotiate that territory without it becoming overwhelming, and a few examples of what this might look like in Key Stage 3. So I'm just going to share a few thoughts as to why Key Stage 3 should be more of a focus. And one of the reasons is that we know that in some schools priorities became distorted. In fact, up until about 2019, about 50% of secondary schools were taking 3 years to do the GCSE and BTEC specifications at Key Stage 4. Now, that's entirely understandable. You can see the arguments made for that. Colleagues saying, well, look, the specifications, the latest round of specifications have been have more challenge in them, and for many of them there's more content. So you can see the argument being made that we need more time in order to teach these greater demanding specifications. That being said, pupils and students are entitled to a broad and balanced curriculum until the end of Key Stage 3, which is year 9. And so the concern is that Key Stage 3, if it was just 2 years, was seen as a sort of mini Key Stage 4, and actually children not getting their entitlement to the end of year 9 if they were not going to take that subject as an option. And so that was one reason. It's never a blame game. You can understand how that happened. It meant that pupils had mixed experiences because of this. And so some would have, if they were taking that as a subject, as an option all the way through, they would be fine. But you would have students whose experiences would be curtailed because they were essentially finishing their courses just after 2 years, which was a shame. And then you'd also got the issue of transition. And what I mean here is between Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3, you've got how this has played into a diminished Key Stage 3 over the years is that insufficient time has been paid, or attention has been paid, I'm generalizing here, but across the secondary part of the sector in terms of what pupils have been learning in primary. And so what has fairly often happened, and I know it sometimes still goes on, is that students are being taught material and content which actually they've already been taught in primary. And so there's this idea that you know, they haven't come across stuff before. Many of them have been taught the material that is actually taught at Key Stage 3 in primary. So you've got this overlapping of material. Then we wonder why children sometimes become uninterested, lose interest, because they think, well, we've already been taught this. Now, it's one thing to reteach something specifically because you know it's not secure. It's something about which there are many misconceptions. But for the most part, that's not the case. It's just been retaught. And so you sometimes had novels being taught in year 8, which actually children had already encountered sometimes in year 5. So it's just about that sort of weakness of not understanding where children already were. The other thing in relation to that is that when you've got schools that have got strong links across transition, across Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3 in particular, for the purposes of this session, there's a real appreciation from secondary colleagues about the standards in primary. So not just the content, but where they get the chance to see children's work, to go into lessons, they realise just how high standards are across primary. And so again, that raises the game in secondary and stops it being a bit of a poor relation, as we know from Anne Senevratne's work, The Wasted Years from 2015. Sometimes it was just seen as the poor relation. And I think even if we don't think it is still a poor relation, I think we can still ramp it up even further for all these reasons. So I'm just going to turn now to what it is that pupils themselves say about how they think about the work that they are offered. And this is really to make the case that we can inject far more rigor into Key Stage 3, and I would argue all the way through the key stages as a general rule than we do currently. So the argument I'm making is that we can make the curriculum offer quite a bit more demanding for all our pupils, regardless of their starting points, regardless of the key stage. In this example, Key Stage 3. So I've got an example, first of all, from secondary, but at the heart of what students are saying to me is that they would like more demanding work. They would like more demanding work. And I think as a sector, we can be inclined to make things too easy for too many of our pupils in the mistaken belief they can't cope. So I've got a couple of examples, one from year 9 and actually one from year 6, because I think wherever we are thinking about the curriculum and experiences for pupils and students, we can draw across different key stages. So the one from secondary, I was doing a piece of work in London before lockdown, and I've been asked by the school to talk to some students that they'd identified as being high prioritaining, but underachieving, able but idle. And we recognise those characters, don't we? And so I was sitting down and talking to these students. There were about half a dozen of them. They were year 9s and they happened to be all boys. And I said, is there any subject in this school where you're not messing around? Because they weren't learning, but they were stopping others from learning. That's what I really wanted to unpick with them. And they said, well, we don't mess around in geography. So I said, well, tell me what's going on in geography then. And they said, well, our teacher just gives us really interesting, difficult stuff to work on, both in lessons and for homework. So, for example, for homework, she'll give us articles to read from proper geographical publications. And what she says to us is, your job for homework is to read this. Now, you're not going to understand it all, but that's all right, because at the start of the next lesson, we're going to talk about what you did understand and what you didn't understand. And they were just absolutely lapping it up. And when I was, they went on to say, actually, sometimes she gives us material that would be used in universities, don't you know? They were quivering with excitement. Now, it's not that they would have worked all their way through the university material, but they were being shown where the subject might go. The teacher was paying them a compliment in a sense. And when I was in this teacher's classroom later that day with these students in there, she had the same high expectations for all the students, regardless of their starting points, and mixed prior attainment. And when I checked the results for geography in that school, they were the highest by a margin in a very high performing school. Now, that teacher didn't give those students difficult, demanding work in order to get great results. The great results follow from them being given this difficult, demanding work. And, you know, as you could tell from that example, they were relishing it. So those were high attaining students. And I'm just going to share a quick example now from primary. It's from Alison Peacock's work, Assessment for Learning Without Limits, which came out in 2015. And Alison, as I'm sure you know, is the CEO of the Chartered College of Teaching and doing brilliant work there. And in the book, Assessment for Learning Without Limits, Alison and a colleague are talking to some pupils as they go from year 5 into year 6, and they're trying to tease out what the children thought about ability groups, ability tables. But in fact, the children's responses are about the level of work that they're given, which is why I'm using it. So the first day the children were back, we asked them what they thought of ability groups. The answers were astounding. The more able loved it. They enjoyed being the bright ones and having special challenges set by the teacher. The middle group were annoyed they didn't get the same work and challenges as the other group. They wanted to try harder work, but they'd worked out they'd never be moved up as there were only 6 seats on the top table. The less able were affected the most. They felt dumb, useless. They thought they'd never be allowed challenges as they usually work with a teaching assistant. And this less able group liked the sound of some of the challenges the top group had, but they knew they would never get the chance. I always find it really hard to say that last sentence, because what we're doing is we are offering some of our children a diminished diet in the mistaken belief that they can't cope. And so I'm taking from these examples, and I have plenty more, which I don't have time to share on this session, is that our children relish doing difficult, demanding work, makes them feel clever. At whatever key stage, but I'm particularly arguing at key stage 3. So one of the questions we want to be asking ourselves is what we're offering our pupils and students in terms of entitlement. Is it truly ambitious? But if we're going to give our children difficult work at whatever key stage, and in these examples for key stage 3, we have to make sure that that high challenge is balanced with low threat. Because nobody wants to be made to feel stupid. No one wants to be made to feel stupid. So really, really important that we don't let our pupils sink or swim. We let them know that we're there to hold them intellectually. No one's going to feel as though they can't cope. And if you notice what that geography teacher said with those year 9 students, she said, you're not going to understand all this that I'm setting you for homework, but that's all right, because we're going to talk about what you did and you didn't. That's classic high challenge and low threat. So we kind of get the gist. We get the gist from that. So the next thing I'd like to turn to when we're thinking about whether we're being truly ambitious for all our pupils and students, regardless of their starting points, is thinking about the way that we talk about the individual subjects. And just a short element on this to sort of build the argument for making it to Barney at key stage 3. But there are 3 things I find it quite helpful when I'm talking with colleagues, is to say, well, have we got the big picture of the subject? What's the big scope of it? What's magical about it? And I make no apology talking about what's magical about it, because the subjects are magical. They're the gateways into pupils and students having real insights and purchase on the world. And so we need to, I think, be talking in that kind of amplified kind of language. I'm not suggesting everyone copies this, but I feel really strongly what's magical about it. And then what's the unique contribution that each subject makes to both the human and the intellectual development of our young people. So what would happen if our children came to school, they weren't taught any design and technology, or they didn't get the chance to learn any history, or they didn't have the chance to learn any PE or whatever. So each subject has got this strong foundational place in human development is what I'm arguing. And it seems to me it follows from that we need to be talking about it in the most generous terms and the most generous language. And so quite often when I'm talking to people about, well, what are you trying to do? What's the purpose of history in this school, or your intent, or whatever, geography, and whatever subject? And quite often there's a pause, and people quite often open a file, whether a physical file or a one on a laptop, before they pull up a document. It's not at their fingertips, which I think is a shame. And so one of the things I think can be helpful is have a short, punchy way of describing the significance of the subject to us as we teach it, or if we're leading it. So I've got a few examples here just to sort of kick off discussions more widely, which some schools have found helpful. So if, for instance, I'm teaching art and design in any part of the sector, but we're thinking specifically here about Key Stage 3, what do I make of this quote from Don Miguel Ruiz? Every human is an artist. Every human is an artist. I don't have to agree with it, but I think how we talk about the subject is really, really important. So what I'm arguing is that we have a significant way of summarizing the significance of the subject for us as we teach it, that obviously taps into the national curriculum documents and the exam specifications, but this comes from this broader place. This then does two things. It's intended to do things, and for the most part it does. It gives us an additional level of energy as we talk about the subjects, the beauty and the strength of them, kind of elevates them when we're talking to pupils and students and parents and anyone else about what it is that we're working on it within a subject. But also it creates the level of quality control in terms of what we offer our pupils and students to do in lessons. If I'm saying this or something similar that resonates with me, am I making sure that the materials and the resources and the text and everything I offer my pupils and students reflect these ambitious intent, this ambitious way of talking about it? So I've done these for all the national curriculum. I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm just going to pause on a handful of them. So if we consider history for a moment, this is from Marcus Garvey, who's actually paraphrasing a research paper, but it's attributed to him. He says, a people without the knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots. It's like a tree without roots. So if I agree with that, don't have to, but if I disagree with it, what's my rationale for teaching history? Which I'm arguing needs to be more than sort of dry statements on a document. Lovely one which provokes lots and lots of discussion with secondary colleagues. Czech proverb: for languages you live a new life for every language you speak. If you only know one language, you only live once. And would love to run this one from Einstein past some Key Stage 3 students, to what extent they agree with him that pure mathematics is in its way the poetry of logical ideas. So I'm just going to finish with music. Unfortunately, it's by Nietzsche, who was a bit of a dodgy character, but it's a great quote, which is why I'm using it. Without music, life would be a mistake. Without music, life would be a mistake. And so the argument I'm making is that it's this kind of narrative that elevates the subjects as they are conceived and delivered across all the key stages, but in particular, the argument I'm making for Key Stage 3. I'm now going to just touch on transition again and see if we can gain a picture going across the subjects over time. And so what I've done is I've developed a 5-step overview, which is work in progress. So I'd be interested in people's responses to this, because it's material I'm still working through my thinking on, that we want to get a sense of what is this subject like across all the key stages as a child travels through, makes their journey through school. And the idea here, when we're thinking about key stage 3, is that we're mindful of this bigger picture of where the subject has come from and where it might go, and how we might support it with some really rich resources. So there are 5 steps. The first is, I think it's important that there's a subject overview, which is basically, if we take the example for geography, would be the important statements in the national curriculum. And so my view is that the national curriculum important statements are really, really worth paying attention to when we're getting greater rigor and at key stage 3, because there can be a tendency to go straight to the programs of study. This happens in primary as well, which is fine, but it means that it's not going to be as integrated and as meaningful in terms of the way we think and plan the curriculum if we haven't done this, the important statements first of all. So on my website, marymyatt.com, there's the 5 steps there, which we're just working on. They're available to watch out now. We're just fine-tuning them. Is that you would come to this page and you would go to the national important statements, and from there's a link then to the national curriculum. I believe it needs to be in that order. The second thing that we're developing is, or we're making available, is that in this subject of geography, for this example, you'd then take a look, if you were teaching at key stage 3, at what is being taught in primary from the primary chapter. And these are free, we're making these available online, these individual chapters. Just to get an example, in this case, from Tom Brassington, is who we spoke to for primary Ha. The Ha, by the way, is the Egyptian god of everlasting things, regeneration and creativity, which captures our work on the curriculum. And so you've got this lovely quote from Tom Brassington, teaching and leading in primary geography. I want pupils to know how the world has developed and changed over time, not just in terms of the physical processes, but also how human interaction with the planet has altered its trajectory. So if I'm teaching at key stage 3, I might be thinking, wow, this is a big ambition for primary. I want them to be able to think like geographers, to be able to look at the world and think, how have the processes of this planet come together physically to create this aspect that I'm looking for? How have human actions affected the planet? And what might this look like in the future? The national curriculum talks about curiosity and the fascination that's lifelong, and we want children to be able to be lost in wonder at this beautiful world we live in. So those are just a few extracts from what a primary colleague is saying that they are conceiving of geography in their school, and then of course goes into lots and lots of detail about that in the chapter, which you can read as well. And it's then that we would look at an example from secondary. And so we've taken the example from the secondary curriculum conversations between subject and senior leaders. And this time it would be David Priest, Dr. David Priest, who John Thompson and I interviewed for this. And then you can see what David is arguing. We want our students to be mindful of their positionality within the world. We use concepts of place and space as examples of the lenses through which geographers view the world in order to understand how the world works. Where do they sit compared with other people? How does their experience, their status in terms of social position, education, economic ranking, and their identity compare with the rest of the world? In the end, what you want a geographer to do is to be able to go out into the world as a thoughtful citizen, understand what's going on, and understand how they can choose to make a difference. So what we've got here are examples from Dr. David Priest talking about the high level of ambition for geography in secondary, and we're then able to compare that, for instance, with see the synergy that there is in primary as well, so that you're getting this thread of ambition all the way through, but it's located in Key Stage 3, that we're not dumbing it down at all. So then we would go to some primary subject examples. So for instance, secondary colleagues wanting to see what's going on in primary could take a look at, say, the primary subject networks for geography, and to see the level of demand and interest and, I would say, scholarship in primary. So this is an example. This is a geography example from Haida Fayez. This is the autumn one. With her resources, you can then see what high quality primary geography is looking at, thinking, my goodness, where could it then go with secondary? If they're already doing this at Key Stage 2, where could it go in secondary? And so then we might tap into the secondary subject networks and see, for instance, in one example that we've got here, how about 5 colleagues are talking in the geography roundtable discussion about how they're using high quality texts at Key Stage 3 to underpin their curriculum. That example was a 5-step overview for geography, to give people an overview of where it's gone before and to make sure that it is pitched sufficiently high, tapping into colleagues who are already doing demanding work. So I'm going to turn now to some of the findings from the research, cognitive science and psychology, that can help us refine our thinking about how to make greater demands at Key Stage 3, so that we can then position it as the intellectual powerhouse in terms of the curriculum in secondary schools. So just a few headlines from here. Peter Brown and his colleagues' work, first of all, Rodiger McDaniel, they make the argument that learning is not likely to be secure unless we put some effort into it. So what we'll find with a lot of these findings from cognitive science is that a lot of them are common sense. It's like, did we need the research to tell us some of this stuff? We sort of knew it anyway, didn't we? But it might be common sense, but it's not yet common practice. And so that's why I think it's worth pulling it up. And then we've got Dan Willingham, familiar to many of you, I'm sure. Why don't students like school? Professor of psychology at the University of Virginia, and have been taking the findings from the field of psychology and cognitive science, saying these might have implications for classroom practice. Not a 3-line whip. We've drawn this insofar as it's helpful. So what has he found? He's found that human beings are curious. And again, did we need the research to tell us this? We didn't really. We kind of know it in any case. But it's a really useful insight when we're thinking about the curriculum, and particularly if we want to really make it robust and buzzing and fizzing at Key Stage 3, to tap into this notion that human beings are curious. And we'll see an example of that in a moment. But thinking is hard. Yes, it's meant to be. And it's my job as a teacher to help my pupils and students over that hard bit. So what I'm going to share with you now is echoing back to what pupils and students are saying, that they enjoy doing this demanding work. So don't let's shy away from it. So I've got an example next from history, Year 7. And this is Richard Kennett's work, brilliant historian and a senior leader across a trust in Bristol. And I'm just going to show you one of his homeworks that he's given his Year 7 class as they've been learning about the Norman Conquest. So this is what he's given them for homework, where he's tested out the scholarship reading homework with the Year 7 guinea pig class. He found every student could access it, even those with a reading age below 10. Clearly, we need to have higher expectations of these students. So what has Richard given them for homework? Well, he's not given them a dumbed down text. He's given them extracts from Mark Morris's account of the Norman Conquest. And Mark Morris, as I'm sure we know, is a world-renowned historian. And what Richard has said to his students is, for homework, read these 2 pages and answer all the questions. This is supposed to be hard. So if you can't answer all the questions, don't worry. If you can't answer all the questions, don't worry. So this is classic high challenge, low threat. He's pitching it high. He's placing it in the disciplinary canon, and he's offering it to his children in the spirit of high challenge and low threat. This is supposed to be hard, high challenge. So don't worry if you can't answer all the questions. That's the low threat. And because he's taken the concern, the worry, the threat away, all the pupils have had a go. And it's this kind of work that I argue is evidence of the Key Stage 3 curriculum being treated as though it's the intellectual powerhouse of the secondary school. It's exactly the kind of thing we want. And when I'm arguing, I'm very happy for people to disagree with me. And when I talked to Richard about why he was offering his pupils this demanding work, he said, well, when we're learning about the Norman Conquest in lessons, I'm using extracts from Simon Schemer's account or views on the Norman Conquest. He said, what I want my students understanding is that while there might be historical events that are uncontested, historians disagree about the significance and the impact of those events. So really taking pupils and students in at a deep level, just lovely, lovely to see. So again, from Willingham, further insights is that we know more and remember more if we understand the concepts and the big ideas. And so the concepts, pulling those out at Key Stage 3 means that if they are taught well, 2 things happen. One is the students that are going to go on and study that subject, if it's an option at Key Stage 4 and they choose to take it, so we're not talking about the core, we're talking about the optional subjects, they will have a really seriously good grounding, because we know we should not be bringing down Key Stage 4 content to Key Stage 3. Why would you do that? Because it's not the national curriculum. But we want to make it really demanding, really intellectually exciting for pupils and students. And this is one of the ways to do it is to identify the concepts. But it's also important for those students who won't be taking the subject on at Key Stage 4, that they will end Key Stage 3 with having a real purchase on the big ideas, you know, the beauty of the subject, even if they're not able to take it on to Key Stage 4. And the reason this so powerful, we got this from Steven Pinker as well. Cognitive psychology has shown the mind best understands facts when they're woven into a conceptual fabric, such as a narrative, a mental map, or intuitive theory. Disconnected facts in the mind are like unlinked pages on the web. They might as well not exist. So I have to be careful when I'm quoting people of my confirmation biases. I've obviously picked this because it's, I agree with it, but it's expressed in pretty strong terms, let's say that. But there is something really important here, is that the concepts, if they're well taught and offered to our pupils and students, can really offer depth and insight and rigor to the individual subjects. And they act as kind of holding baskets for a lot of information. And so Key Stage 3 is an ideal time to be digging deep into these lovely, rich concepts. And there are plenty of them. But there aren't too many. And I've done a slightly longer piece because people have been asking me for this for use in schools, a series of about 5 videos helping pupils to learn the curriculum through various elements, and in this example, concepts. So I'm just going to give a quick example of what this looks like from one school, and I offer it just as an example of how we might thread a concept through a Key Stage 3 curriculum. And so this is a school near Bristol, Queen Elizabeth, who shared this. And what they wanted to do was to build cultural capital in the core curriculum. So this is a curricular decision that they'd made, and so they decided to use Key Stage 3 to make this an intentional part of their curriculum. Choose something else. This is what they decided to do. And you can see that they decided to go back to the origins of Western literature, ancient Greece, and to consider and learn about some of the classics, to learn some of this important, not just vocabulary, but powerful rhetorical ideas of ethos, logos, and pathos, which they're going to be using as they go through the school, but with particular resonance at Key Stage 4. And you can see the lovely big ideas, epic, peripeteia, beer, etc. But I just want to pull up on this one on hubris. So they decided to take the concept of hubris, that idea that human beings can sometimes be overreaching, and through vanity, greed, and ambition come a cropper. We've had quite a few examples of that in public life recently, but we kind of recognize it. That notion of hubris is a human trait which we need to be mindful of, and it's there in literature as well. And so what they've done is they were working out their curriculum, and I'm just looking at 7, 8, and 9, is they took the concept of hubris, and so where are we going to weave it through? Where are we going to pull that out across the curriculum? So you can see how a big idea, there will be others as well. This is just one example. They decided to be able to thread that through their English curriculum. Okay, another example from another school in Bristol, Sarah Barker's school, where she shared this at ResearchEd. They used Key Stage 3 in a slightly different way, but again, with ambition and intellectual rigor behind it. So they decided to go into the background of what students were going to be studying at Key Stage 4. So the Dickens A Christmas Carol, they decided to go into the historical background, social issues, both current and historical, and then started to map out how they were going to consider the curriculum at Key Stage 3. Now, when Sarah was sharing this with me, she said, you can see the great themes there, can't you? She said, oh, it starts to get a bit messy. That's not the point. The point is it makes sense to the people who are using it. Just because it sits neatly on a spreadsheet does not mean it's great. It's how it's brought to life. So if this makes sense to colleagues, this is how we think about pulling our ideas together. Okay, so that's a sort of superficial, secretarial element. The bigger point I want to make here is that they've decided to use Key Stage 3 to do this big, deep background knowledge, foregrounding what was going to be taught at Key Stage 4. And when I talked to Sarah, she said it could be argued that we're teaching Key Stage 4 material at Key Stage 3. She's not, and they know they're not when they were developing this. It's not. It's going in with great rigor to present the background to what's going to be really helpful for students when they come to study the novel. So I'm going to just share a handful of things quickly and then wrap up. The other thing to say is that about the concepts are generally Tier 3 vocabulary. We know all vocabulary is important, and but Tier 3 is the gateway into the individual subjects. And we've got an opportunity at Key Stage 3 to really power up the Key Stage 3 vocabulary. And much of that vocabulary has big words, often roots in other languages, and we've got an opportunity to go into the etymology or the roots of the words, which will deepen pupils' and students' understanding. And if, for example, we think of the term isosceles, we can talk to pupils and students at Key Stage 3 about what an isosceles triangle is, and they can generally tell us, but that's because we're very good at teaching definitions. But what I'm arguing is that students' understanding of what an isosceles triangle is would be deeper if they knew that it comes from two Greek words. Isos is equal, skeles is legs. Got a bigger mental picture. And it also means when they meet isobar, isometric, and other parts of the curriculum, they're likely to recognize that it's got something to do with equal. So we're powering them up when we do this kind of work. Sometimes people say to me, Mary, this is a bit hard. And I say, yeah, it's meant to be. As we know from the research, you know, hard is good. But students have also said they like doing difficult, demanding work. But we've also got pupils in the sector, very young, some of them even in reception, who are fluent in dinosaurs. And some of those children, a handful of those children also know that the word dinosaur comes from two Greek words, dinos is scary and sauros is lizard. So if they can do it at 4, they can do it all the way through. And so very easy to drop this element of rigor, depth, academic excitement into the curriculum at Key Stage 3 by doing this. Interestingly, the schools that are doing this kind of work, they say it's the children with the greatest language deficit that make the greatest gains in their learning. And so when they talk to those children about why they're getting on so well, they say 2 very interesting things. We like finding this stuff out. That's because their curiosity has been provoked, which is another insight, as we know. And they go on and say things like, it makes us feel clever. It makes us feel clever. And I think we've got a real opportunity at Key Stage 3 to make our children feel clever by treating Key Stage 3 as the intellectual powerhouse of the school. I'm going to very quickly share a piece of research that came out of Sussex University just to wrap this bit up. It's this idea that our brain's privileged story, we know more and remember more if we've heard it in a story. We've heard this from Pinker, who's talking about a narrative, a mental map, or intuitive theory. Disconnected facts are like unlinked pages on the web. They might as well not exist. What I'm arguing is that we take on board what we can do at Key Stage 3 to make the curriculum underpinned by high quality texts. We know we've got work to do because there's a reading deficit of our children, about a quarter of them not reaching the expected standard by the time they arrive with us at Key Stage 3. And why aren't we doing more to read with them? Well, it's enjoyable, so we think it can't be work. We think we don't have the time, and then we're really worried about the evidence. So let's just have a quick look before I wrap this up about some research which came out of Sussex University that found that simply reading challenging, complex novels loud at a fast pace at each lesson repositioned poorer readers as good readers, giving them a more engaged, uninterrupted reading experience over a sustained period. So they selected 2 novels, the schools that were in this research. That's all they did for 12 weeks. They read in English, radical, we read in English. Wasn't a huge trial, 365 year 8s. And they found at the end of this trial, the reading ages for the cohort as a whole in that time had increased by 8.5 months. And for the students who'd been identified as poorer readers, it was almost double at 16 months. So, I don't think we can afford to ignore this kind of research wherever we sit in the sector. And I'm thinking particularly at Key Stage 3, beyond English, how am I taking account of these kinds of insights and underpinning my curriculum when I'm working out new units with high quality texts? 2 things to say very quickly before I wrap this up is that when they talk to those students about why they'd done so well, they said they don't normally get the chance to do this interesting work. So if we're thinking about making Key Stage 3 the intellectual powerhouse of the school, we need to be thinking about it for all pupils and students, not just some. Because a lot of our children who are deemed to have fallen behind, they get a diet of phonics, SPAG, decoding, leveled readers, all of which are necessary but not sufficient. If we want to see these kinds of results, we have to lift the lid on what they're capable, but what we offer them. And then the second thing they said is we didn't need to understand every word. We wanted to find out what happens next. Curiosity had been provoked. So what I'm arguing is that we build in far more high quality text with a narrative element at Key Stage 3 to get this rigor in there. They matter, high quality texts, to get this intellectual powerhouse going because they create the big picture. A well-chosen text contains complex ideas. They enrich students' vocabulary, and as we've just seen there, they're inclusive for all. So colleagues, I'm going to stop there, and I'm very happy to take questions, but I hope you agree with me. I've made the case that we can have greater rigor at Key Stage 3 as a default to make it the intellectual powerhouse of the secondary school. Thank you.